There we go. Now, looking at the Brainstem Contents, we talked a whole lot about the Brainstem so far in the semester, and based on everything you've learned so far, can anyone tell me what you'd expect if I did a cross section? Let's just say a transverse section here in the midbrain. Okay, let's talk. If I did a cross section right here in the midbrain, so let's say rostral midbrain. If I did a transverse section right here in the caudal pons or the rostral medulla, what kinds of things would I expect to see? Just a plain old section. We're going to do that today. What would I expect to be in there based on everything you guys have learned so far this semester? Sorry? Yeah, cranial nerves. Yeah, cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, let's start with that, number one. So let's say cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, so if I did a cross section here, here, and here, depending on where I did my cross section, I might see different cranial nerve nuclei, right? So hopefully you remember that way up in the midbrain, I'm going to see cranial nerve number 3. Down in the pons, I see abducens, cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 8, right? All those things are possible. And way down in the medulla, cranial nerve 12, nucleus ambiguous, all those motor nuclei that we talked about previously. Okay. Now, what else might I see if I did a cross? Yeah, Jeff?
You see some of the tracks.
Yeah, tracks. Name a track.
Spinal track.
Yeah, okay. Then let's talk about afferent tracks. I'd expect to see afferent tracks. Okay, so one afferent tract that I might expect to see is my spinothalamic tract, right? What other afferent tract might I expect to see? Yeah, DCML. And at the level of the, above the caudal medulla, what's it called? What's that tract called at that level? Medial lemniscus, right? So this is, I expect to see the pathway, the tract DCML, but specifically, I'm looking for the medial lemniscus to show up. Anything else I might see in there? Yeah.
The part of the ventricular system is the fourth ventricle.
Yeah, I could see. Yeah, I'll put that down. Sure, that's great. So I might see ventricular system pieces and parts, right? Specifically, if I were looking at the midbrain, what's the name of the part of the ventricular system that I might see? Cerebral aqueduct. Yes. Now, how about at the level of the pons? What part of the ventricular system would I see? Fourth ventricle. Awesome. Okay. What else might I see? What else did we talk about? What's responsible for motor function that is definitely going to be running through there? Yeah, the corticospinal tracts. Let's talk efferent tracts. The big one, corticospinal tract. It's going to be huge. Now, talked about that would be motor function for the extremities and trunk. We also talked just briefly a little bit on Lesson Wednesday about this other tract that's responsible for upper motor neurons going to the lower motor neurons in the brainstem or the cranial nerve. What do you remember what the name of that tract? Cortico something. That's a Not spino. It's corticobulbar, right? Corticobulbar tract. So I definitely see my corticobulbar tract. The corticobulbar tract is nothing more than the axons from the upper motor neuron going down to the level of the cranial nerve nuclei and innervating those cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, so the lower motor neuron, the upper motor neuron from the primary motor cortex, axons descending. So I'm going to see the corticobulbar and the corticospinal tracts. One more thing I might see. We talked about the I could see rubrospinal, but right now I've kind of simplified this down to something really easy, and the easy part is I'm only worried about patient presentation. So I can tell you that if a person has a brainstem stroke and the rubrospinal tract is affected, I'm not going to see it in patient presentation. It would be there, absolutely. I'm going to see all those. I'll see reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, depending on the cross-section area, right? But it doesn't result in the patient presentation. So I'm not going to fuss with that right now. But there's something else that we talked about that is going to be a big structural feature, particularly in the pons. Yeah, Sam?
Oh, I was thinking about the medullary pyramids.
Yeah, well, you see the pyramids. Well, you'll see the corticospinal tract. That'll be a big part of the bump coming out in the front. But thinking about how does the brainstem connect to the cerebellum? Peduncles, you're right. So let's say the last thing that we're going to see that's going to be a big structure is going to be your cerebellar connections or connectors. Okay, and that specifically is going to be your inferior, middle, and superior peduncles, cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so thinking about what all these things are, let's go ahead and draw in. There's a main sensory nucleus. Thinking about cranial nerve nuclei, something that you're definitely going to see. There's a main sensory nucleus here that has to do with the face, anything above the neck, and it's going to come all the way down, be present in this area here. Does anybody remember what that one is called? Yeah, spinal nucleus. Main sensory and spinal nucleus of trigeminal. So let's just say spinal nucleus of trigeminal. Okay. Another one is going to be, and these are going to be present bilaterally, of course. Another one coming down here, you're going to see, let's see in the middle, this big old nucleus is responsible for tongue muscles movement. Anybody remember the name of that? That's your hypoglossal nucleus. Cranial nerve 12. Alright, so those would be some nice cranial nerve nuclei to think about. You know, you're also going to see up here at this level, this is going to be your oculomotor nucleus, so cranial nerve number 3. Okay, so just examples of things that you might see in some of these cross sections and where they come about. Okay, the next one on the list. Oh, afferent tracts. Okay, definitely. We're definitely going to see some afferent tracts. Let's look at STT. Somebody said STT first, so here's your STT, first order neuron here. Neural cell body, so you're going to come into the spinal cord, synapse right away, decusate, and then go all the way up on the opposite side. Uh-huh. There. Is that good? We're just drawing the STT, and that's going to synapse. Go through the thalamus and then synapse above. Okay, DCML, you're going to see the same thing. You're going to have DCML, first order neuron, coming in. Going to go up to the level of the caudal medulla, come over, all the way up, go through the thalamus, and then eventually get up there to the somatosensory cortex. Right, that's your DCML. So those are going to be your afferent tracts. And you're also going to have, coming out of, that's going to the somatosensory cortex. I can write that in there. Okay, and then this is the motor cortex. Coming out of the motor cortex, you're going to have corticospinal tract. here, coming on down to the level of caudal medulla, decusating, coming across and innervating skeletal muscles. Okay, so this is your cortico-spinal tract. And you also had that other one is your corticobulbar tract. So upper motor neuron here, coming on down at the level of whatever synapse is. And let's say this is the trigeminal motor. Synapse is here. This is going to be your corticobulbar tract. You can see everything. Okay, so in general, you know, when we take these cross sections and look in different places, we would expect to see all these things. Questions? Like I said, there are other things in there, absolutely, we have talked about all semester. However, I'm only going to present to you what you need to know for PACIT presentation, specifically for the brainstem vascular syndromes that we're going to cover at the end of the semester. This is what you need to know. This is going to produce a patient presentation if it is effective. Got it? Okay. Moving on, this is brainstem contents. Let's look at medulla, nuclei, and tracts. And like I said, this year I tried to simplify it a little bit more. And that if you're working offline, if you don't have a printout, you have a little dot here that I've whited out on my copy. Okay, you don't need to worry about that dot this year. But if you have the printed out copy, you can just white that out or cross it out. There's just a little dot to the end of the structure here. Just trying to make it easy to remember. All right, what you're looking at here is your rostral medulla. Okay, cross section through the rostral medulla, and this is going to be dorsal, and this is going to be ventral. And I can tell you that depending on which textbook you look at, sometimes they'll have dorsal up top, sometimes they'll have ventral. For consistency's sake, I'm just going to keep ventral on the bottom. Okay, and we know that the cranial nerve nuclei, all of them exit the brainstem ventrally, except for cranial nerve number 4, right? It's the only one that goes out the backside and it decusates. So this is going to be a cranial nerve, one of those big old cranial nerve nuclei with the cranial nerve coming out of the nucleus here that is going to exit the brainstem at the pre-olivary sulcus, which is right here. Which cranial nerve would that be? Anybody? So what cranial nerve exits the medulla at the area of the pre-olivary sulcus, which is right there? Innervates tongue muscles. Yeah, this is cranial nerve 12. That's cranial nerve 12 here. Okay, and this is your hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, not something that you'd expect to see there in the medulla. Thinking about other things that we've already covered. Another thing that we've already covered, most ventrally. So here's the bump. These are the two main bumps in the front of the medulla. And these are your main motor tracts for extremities and trunk. What carries motor information for the extremities and trunk? Yep, this is going to be your corticospinal tract right here. Okay. Very ventral, most ventral, a large amount of axons, enough to cause little bumps, known as the pyramids. Okay, so this is your corticospinal tract. One thing we haven't mentioned before is the concept of the term lemniscus. Lemniscus really means, has to do with the shape that you see, and the shape is sort of long and elongated, okay? And this thing is medial, and it's elongated shape, so your medial lemniscus is going to be here. Again, medial lemniscus is going to carry that DCML information, vibration, fine touch, and proprioception from upper and lower extremities all the way up. That's something else we've seen before. Okay, so lemniscus, long shape, and it's very medial, so this is your medial lemniscus. Also thinking about sensory information traveling up from the trunk and extremities. It's going to be your spinal thalamic tract, and your spinal thalamic tract is going to be right here. Okay, these are all things we'd expect to see. Okay, and then moving on up, there's a little kidney bean shaped thing here. And this is the nucleus that's responsible for receiving sensory information, general sensory information from the face, which was, what would that be? What receives general sensory information from the face? It's a cranial nerve nuclei. Yeah, it's the spinal nucleus of trigeminal. It's the spinal nucleus of trigeminal. Okay, and then this is going to be the nucleus that, it's a cranial nerve nucleus that doesn't know who it belongs to. It is the motor nucleus for both cranial nerve number 9 and cranial nerve number 10, right there. Anybody remember that nucleus name? Yep, that's nucleus ambiguus. Nucleus ambiguous. And up here in the far corners, and the most dorsal here, this at the level of the rostral medulla, you have a little bit of the connector of the brainstem to the cerebellum, and this is going to be very inferior, so this is going to be your inferior cerebellar peduncle, just a little bit. One more thing that we've covered previously, and this is going to be that, and you can see here's your pyramid, that next bump back, this is your olive. Now, olive is a great big old bump because of this nucleus here that's involved in motor learning, has intimate connections with both Purkinje cells and deep nuclei in the cerebellum. Does anybody remember the name of this nucleus? Yeah, this is going to be your inferior olivary nucleus. Right here. So everything we've hit except for two little circles, or one on top of the medial lemniscus. And this thing, you usually find it hanging around with the medial lemniscus somewhere in close proximity. It's something we're going to talk about when we get to the vestibular portion of the course. This is known as your medial, because it's medial, longitudinal fasciculus. Yeah, we haven't covered it yet, but we will. This is your medial longitudinal fasciculus. And there's only one more left, and that's this little dot here that hangs around with the spinothalamic tract. Something we'll cover when we get to brainstem vascular syndromes. And this is going to be your sympathetic tract. So for the most part, we know all the players, except we're going to learn about the medial longitudinal fasciculus and the sympathetic tract here in a little bit. Questions? All it is, make cross section. These are all things we'd expect. Just introduce two new little areas: MLF, medial longitudinal fasciculus, and sympathetic tract, right there. Okay. And then this is going to be the, moving on, this is the caudal pons, nuclei, and tracts. Okay, for the caudal pons, nuclei, and tracts, we can start with this. There's a great big old hole in the middle of the pons. It's part of the ventricular system. Any ideas? That's your fourth ventricle. Very good. That's your fourth ventricle. Okay. Thinking about things that we know we've covered before. This. Oh. Let's go ahead and say that this is the dorsal end, and then this is ventral. Okay, we've talked before about that tract that carries motor information from the primary motor cortex all the way down to the extremities. It's still here. Yep, that's your corticospinal tract. Spinal tract. Thinking about cranial nerve nuclei, there is a cranial nerve that is most medial in the pons. So pons has 4 nuclei, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There's one that's most medial. Which one's most medial? 6. Abducens. This is your abducens nucleus. Which makes this nerve coming out, that's cranial nerve number 6. Abducens. Okay. Interesting. So here's cranial nerve number 6. Going a little bit lateral, the next cranial nerve nucleus in order is going to be cranial nerve number 7. Okay, that's going to be your facial nucleus right there. Okay, the facial nucleus is kind of interesting because when it sends out its axons, it actually wraps around cranial nerve number 6 and then comes out. Forms a little indent called the facial colliculus. This information. But this is, you follow it all the way around, this is cranial nerve number 7. Other cranial nerve nuclei that we've talked about previously. Hopefully you recognize this little kite shape here and the little dot that goes with it. That's going to be, so the little kite shape, that's your vestibular nucleus, and right above that is your cochlear nucleus. So vestibular nucleus, and here's your cochlear. We'll talk in much more detail about these when we get to the vestibular portion of the course. Okay, other things that we've seen before as far as nuclei. This kidney bean shaped thing is involved in receiving general sensory information from the area of the face. And that would be your spinal nucleus of trigeminal. Talked about, so responsible for bringing up sensory information such as pain, crude touch, temperature. This is going to be your STT right here. Usually hanging out with the STT, one we're going to talk about later in the semester, is this little dot. That's your sympathetic tract. One more structure, and again, this is very medial. It's an elongated structure. And this is going to be your medial lemniscus. And then we'll talk about here in a little bit. It's going to be your MLF, or your medial longitudinal fasciculus. We'll learn that it's involved in coordinating eye movements bilaterally. Those are all the main players for the caudal pons as far as nuclei and tracts. Then if we want to go through and look at some of the other ones that we've just talked about, there's going to be way back here, most dorsally, and it was very dorsal, but just a little piece was showing in the area of the medulla. You have this whole region here, and this whole region is going to be your inferior cerebellar peduncle, present bilaterally. Another peduncle that we need to consider, let's go ahead and put that here. This looks circular. In reality, the peduncle itself is going up and down as opposed to horizontally. So this is going to be your superior cerebellar peduncle, major efferent output from the cerebellum. We also talked about another peduncle that's involved in the cerebrocerebellar pathway. It's the biggest one, and that's going to be the rest over here on the sides. Okay, this peduncle is going to be your middle cerebellar peduncle. Bless you. Okay. That's your pons. Questions? questions about the pons? Kind of all the things that we talked about we'd expect to see in the pons. And all these are important to know because they're going to be involved in patient presentation. Okay? Changes to any of these nuclei or parts are going to result in some sort of impairment in the patient that you're going to be able to notice. Okay, last little bit. Let's look at the midbrain. Midbrain is here. Again, this is the rostral midbrain. In the area of the rostral midbrain, we have a cranial nerve that's responsible for innervating the majority of your extraocular eye muscles. And it exits ventrally. Okay, and that's going to be cranial nerve number 3. This is your oculomotor nucleus. And we also talked a little bit about the ventricular system, or that part of the ventricular system that's a really nice landmark for the midbrain. It's going to be right here. It's going to be your cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. And then we talked about previously the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts coming down from the primary motor cortex. Well, there's going to be both of them together is going to create a lot of space, a lot of axons traveling together in three-dimensional space. So that's this whole area here. And this whole area, because it's so large, has so many axons traveling through it, has a special name. This is called your cerebral peduncle. Not cerebellar, this is a cerebral peduncle. Okay, and the cerebral peduncle, like I said, is nothing more than the combination of all those corticospinal tracts and all the corticobulbar tracts traveling together in three-dimensional space. Okay, and they travel in this area here that's very ventral. Corticospinal, corticobulbar are all ventral. The area is known as the cerebral peduncle. Okay, just because we can. There's this nice black substance here. It's present in the midbrain. That's responsible for making dopamine. It's part of the basal ganglia. You can see that there. That's going to be your substantia nigra. Okay. At this level, we've lost a lot of cranial nerve nuclei, but we still have some afferent tracts traveling up. And the one that I hope you've all come to know and love is going to be this here medial lemniscus. So again, it's medial, and it's got an elongated shape, so that's going to be your medial lemniscus. That other afferent tract that's responsible for carrying sensory information of pain, touch, and temperature all the way up to the level of somatosensory cortex is going to be here. That's your STT. Hanging around often with the sympathetic, or with the STT, is this little tract. It's going to be sympathetic tract. Okay. There's only one thing we haven't labeled thus far, and that's right here. This big old nucleus is just a really nice landmark for the midbrain, and this is going to be your red nucleus. We've talked a whole lot about the red nucleus this semester, being involved in upper extremity flexion as well as tone, normal tone in individuals, by way of the cerebellum, and that's going to be your red nucleus. Okay. And that's it. Those are all the brainstem contents that we're going to cover. Questions? Hopefully it's pretty straightforward.